I guess knowing about existential risk is really hard. And I don't know if communicating about it is harder, but it might be. And so we're going to think about communication issues with existential risk. And I think this is something that at least the people in CSER care about deeply for the following sort of reason. I think we all think that the academy has this potential to be like actually really, really useful and stuff, but often it's not very good at that. And one of the things in order to make the academy in fact be useful in various ways is to work out how to translate and communicate things from the academy into the wider ecosystem of ideas and so on and so forth. And so communication is important for that. And as we're going to see over the next 3 talks, communication is going to play at a whole bunch of different levels between scientists and policymakers, between non-scientists or other sorts of experts and laymen and so on and so forth. So it's all very complicated. I think at CSER we've had interesting experiences in trying to put our ideas out there, and I want to start with a very, very brief example. So we had a very nice, in many ways, article come out in UK Wired a while ago, where we were just, talking about existential risk, and what they didn't do was put a giant Terminator on it, which was an improvement from usual, but there's still this kind of dramatic kind of way of putting it. For some reason, we're described as the real-world X-Men and women saving us from existential threats. I think if you read this, you'd be very disappointed to actually meet us. And so I think it's clear that there are real challenges in trying to work out how to communicate about existential risk, and that's what I'm hoping to learn about. So our first speaker is, so we're going to save all our questions till the end. I think the 3 talks are very strongly thematically linked, and so hopefully it's going to work quite well to have a little roundtable at the end. So our first speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Kristel Fourie from the African Centre for Disaster Studies and the Unit for Environment Management. And this is a long thing, the Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences in Northwest University in South Africa, which she tells me is miles away from anywhere. Welcome, Kristel.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today. I've really enjoyed the conversation since yesterday, and I'm not very familiar. I'm very new to the field of existential risk, so please excuse me if I theorize a bit wrongly about certain things. So I just want to thank the organizers of the conference as well. It's been really great, and having us here at Jesus College has been really an experience. So what I'd like to do today is just talk about a bit of the challenges that we have experienced within disaster risk in terms of communicating risk and communicating risk to a wider audience. Okay, so the outline of today is as follows. I'll contextualize disaster risk a bit just to kind of give an indication of how we work with it and how we think about disaster risk. Then talk a bit about the challenges, general challenges, and I've heard many of them mentioned yesterday as well, so I think it would definitely relate. And then I'd like to talk about two communication models that I think is really appropriate for what we're struggling with, and following on to that, communicating about risk and what is important regarding that. And then what does this mean practically for us? Because theoretically there's a lot of solutions or a lot of things that we can think about, but practically how do we actually do this? Just a note that if the sound is not well and you cannot hear well, then please just give me a wave so I'll move closer or, try and do something about it. Okay, so let's start. So historically, disasters have been viewed in many different ways. Early perspectives and assumptions were that disasters are acts of God and events that humans don't have any control over. So many times still today, we hear people speak about disasters in this way, and we hear how powerless they feel when events overwhelm their capacity to deal with them. So as time went on, scholars in disaster studies became increasingly aware of different components at play in disasters and how they develop. And in most disaster research communities I have encountered, as well as in the international policy on disaster, there is the belief that by understanding the interaction between the components of disaster risk and addressing these individually, we can not only reduce the risk of disasters, but actively steer societies away from disaster impacts altogether. The components there for interacting with one another to create disaster risk is firstly hazards. So this is the event. This can be natural or this can be human developed or human induced. Then it's always seen as something that threatens the human lives, environment, or property. The second component here at play is that of vulnerability. So vulnerability is usually judged in terms of a hazard. You're always vulnerable to a specific hazard. And it is here where the hazard has the potential to exploit the vulnerability and cause a disastrous impact. The third component, the third and final component involved in this interaction is that of capacity. And capacity is seen as the means of a community or a society that allows them to withstand the impacts of this event. So our thinking, therefore, in disaster studies regarding disaster risk is that it is the product of all of these interacting elements and components that cause the hazard to exploit the vulnerability and therefore cause the disaster risk impact. If vulnerability is thus addressed, according to our thinking, by building capacity where needed, the impact a hazard might have on a community or society will be less and the risk of a disaster then also less. If we view risk in this way, we can comfortably say that there is no such thing as a natural disaster because, theoretically, all disasters are created by the interaction of these different components and can thus be avoided. Considering this interaction, we therefore work predominantly in risk reduction, disaster risk reduction, meaning that we aim to reduce the risk of disasters by addressing the vulnerabilities. This does not mean that the hazard should be neglected or research on that should be neglected. Obviously, there's a lot of people around the world that are doing, that are doing research on hazards, and this information needs to also filter back into how we address the vulnerability. So, the acknowledgement of the role that humans play in this entire interaction is not only followed by scholars researching disaster risk, scholars studying disaster risk reduction and other fields like climate change and adaptation, as well as those considering events with a far more significant impact on human experience, are increasingly of the opinion that risk in whichever form will be increasingly caused by anthropogenic elements. Some of these risks we cannot as of yet scientifically model, and are still to a large extent unsure of. And this we heard about yesterday, about the lack of evidence and how do we collect data and where do we get the data from. The uncertainty that researchers are working with in these fields pose a very specific challenge towards communicating risk. Communicating risk in fields like disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation become more difficult as evidence of future risk become increasingly littered with uncertainty and requires an increasingly wide variety of groups and stakeholders to actually address this risk. So this brings me to the challenges, and I'm not going to discuss these ones in detail. I feel that a lot of these have been mentioned yesterday as well, and could validate talk each on their own. So the challenges through our experience of research and disaster risk reduction, there are always specific issues we struggle with when it comes to communicating risk or our research specifically. So literature on communication and science, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation indicate that these are common challenges and things that scholars trying to communicate risk identify with and come across with regularly. So the first one I'd just like to mention a couple is the multi and transdisciplinary nature of disaster risk reduction. So where I come from, the phrase disaster risk reduction is everybody's business is thrown around quite a lot and used quite often. But we find it hard to translate the role that different disciplines have to play and need to play within the field of risk reduction to these disciplines. So they sometimes don't know why it's their business or how it should be their business. So the second challenge we also come across, and I think a lot of the issues mentioned yesterday in terms of communication relate quite well to this as well, specifically in academic institutions, is that of support structures enabling communication of risk. So we all know about the phrase publish or perish, and there's a lot of pressure on scholars to actually publish to their peers and in academic, credible journals, etc. So yesterday we mentioned an identification and a consideration towards audience, purpose, and means. And I wonder sometimes if this is really, if researchers and scholars take the time to think about this, or are they under pressure to actually produce research and produce these articles? The third and final one, before I get to the one that I'd really want to focus on, is making risk newsworthy. And I must say, I don't think I've ever heard sexy used in an academic lecture as much as just before the break. So this is also the problem with risk reduction, is that risk reduction is seen as not newsworthy to make it into the media. And I think this is not a challenge that we cannot overcome. I think actually this is an opportunity for us to think about how we place and translate the information that we research so that it can be useful for media and journalists to use and work into their job as well. So finally, the one that I'd actually want to get to in this talk is that of achieving the aim behind why we communicate risk. So I heard someone said on Monday, before a very interesting discussion, just hold on, this is going somewhere. So please just hold on, it's going somewhere. Our aim in communicating research and the risk identified through research is in most cases seen as elementary. So this is something we should know, and it's assumed that we know this. We rarely consider why researchers feel that they have this responsibility to communicate risk. Our aim with the research that we do is to eventually avoid the risk, right? So communication, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation aims at moving stakeholder groups and role players to action in an effort to reduce risk or adapt to that risk. This is a feat that cannot be achieved only by the researchers themselves, and I think many of us sitting here have that frustration. In order to avoid risk, action is needed and change behavior, and this was mentioned just in the discussion in the previous session, is needed, and altered decision-making is necessary by a wide variety of role players. So this might sound like a very obvious and simple deduction, but if we consider how we have tried to accomplish this over the years, it seems that it's not as apparent as we think it is. So why haven't we not been able to create the awareness that we wish to? Why have we not been able to motivate the role players to action? And in many cases, why do we feel that the research that we are doing is not taken seriously enough by those that we think should take it seriously, right? So to me, in my opinion, this relates back to how science has been working with distributing information in the past. And this brings me to the communication models that I'd just quickly would like to discuss. So communication in science have for a long time worked from the assumption that communicating facts is sufficient and effective communication. The assumption is that scientists or researchers will explain the fact of the research to their audience, repeat it if necessary until they understand, and then it is assumed that this communication has been effective. Therefore, if people understand the facts of the research, this in itself will lead to scientific, sound decision-making. And if we follow this line of argumentation for communicating risk, simply explaining risk and having people understand this risk will motivate them to alter behavior and avoid risk. And I think since yesterday, many mentions have been made of how this is not the case, how we struggle to do that. So in this model is known as the knowledge deficit model in science. So in 1987, Needleman has already indicated that information is necessary, but this is not sufficient. We need further action. The same assumption has been followed in disaster risk reduction, in that international policy indicates that risk can be reduced if people are informed. Therefore, similar to the knowledge deficit model, the information transmission model used in disaster risk reduction also argue that if people have information, it will affect change in their behaviors and in their decision. So this is argued by scholars to be inadequate, expert-led, technocratic, unidirectional practice in communication for disaster reduction. So if only communicating information about risk and creating awareness is not adequate to influence change in behavior and bring more scientifically sound decision-making to effect, what then should be done to reach our goals in communicating risk? What influences the successful communicating risk with the aim the success of communicating risk with the aim to avoid, reduce, or adapt to risk? So communication research and risk research both have two specific opinions on what components will motivate action and risk avoidance behavior. Firstly, research in communication theory has long grappled with how to structure communication in fields like development and more recently in risk reduction to influence behavior. After many changes in perspective since World War II, ultimately participatory development communication principles have been identified as the preferred approach. Research about applying these principles found that where the targeted group partake in the process, in the entire process, success of activities are more likely to be recorded, dialogue is a characteristic of these activities, ownership of activities are more likely, and sustainability is better. So similarly, in disaster risk reduction, it has been identified that the reason why many of these initiatives fail is that experts or specialists did not understand communities that they were trying to help. So this brings me to what we should think about when we are communicating risk effectively, or when we try to do that. One thing that researchers in all of these fields agree on is to motivate behavior change, the entire process should be more person-centered, meaning it should be more context-specific, and communities and societies at the center of activity should participate in the entire process. Theoretically, this means that if we want to communicate risk effectively, as researchers studying risk, we need to do two things. The first of that is to understand how people view risk by establishing participation. So there was a question in a previous session asking, how would you effect the change within the problem that you discussed? I think it was asked to Karen. And this is one way in which that can be approached, to establish participation and understand how people see this problem. And the second part of that is to understand the dimensions of risk. So let me move to the first aspect then. In research, participatory development communication identifies various principles that can assist with establishing more participation in disaster risk reduction and in communicating risk in general. One of the strengths of the PDC approach is that it is not just concerned with the transmission and reception of messages and information, as in the two models that I have discussed previously, but it goes further to include the identification, investigation and analysis of problems and issues through dialogue as the function and goal for participatory communication. So following these principles, it's highlighted that in disaster risk reduction research and activities, the communication process should be informed by the community's experience and perception of risk through the process of participation. Therefore, the process starts by understanding first what people think and believe, believe and do about this risk. Understanding this can focus communication about risk more, allow messages about risk to be applicable to those faced with the risk, and be more effective at motivating risk avoidance behavior. More importantly, following the PDC principles, communication about risk will be generated by those at risk and supported then and validated by the research that we do from our side. So risk perception is obviously not a new thing for disaster risk reduction. However, emergence of climate change and the focus on adaptation has stimulated a variety of interesting research in recent years. And this research investigates what influences how people identify risk, how they perceive risk, and how they assess risk. So aspects under investigation include cultural norms, worldviews, belief systems, value systems, and societal norms. For certain disciplines here, that looks like one thing, right? So, but investigating all of these things can contribute. The assumption is that if we understand the influence that these aspects have, then we can better understand what drives behavior, or the lack thereof, when we work with risk. So as an example of this, of one of the influencing aspects, a study by Blanche Greef et al. Indicates cultural time orientation and its influence on how people perceive risk according to how they culturally orientate in terms of time. So how people prioritize different time frames is important when we are communicating about risk, because in different research areas we work with different time scales when it comes to risk. And I think this is also something that was identified yesterday. For example, if a person is more past and present orientated towards time, then future risks like climate change will not be relevant for them at that stage. So we need to find a way of making it relevant for people that orientate themselves differently in culture towards time. This brings me to the second aspect of how we communicate risk effectively, and that is understanding the dimensions of risk. So it is crucial to understand when we communicate about risk, what we refer to and to which timelines we are referring to. So for instance, in disaster risk studies, or disaster risk reduction, we work with a timescale of about 10 to 15 years. We can see this in the international policies that guide the activities in the field. It's all related to 10 to 15-year plans. In comparison to this, climate change research considers a far larger time bracket of about 30 to 50 years or more. And when we get to future generations and considering risk for, in the future, we talk about much larger timescales like 100 or 200 years or even more. So we need to therefore understand this to effectively align communication in order to establish risk avoidance behavior. Otherwise, why are we communicating in the first place? So theoretically, this makes sense. Practically, what does this mean for us and how are we doing this? And I think the presentations previously about how to creatively talk about risk and how to think about these different aspects are one of these ways. So two of the things that I'm aware of currently and involved in to address this issue is that of trying to get researchers closer to people experiencing risk, and by doing this by storytelling. So one of the examples is something that's currently in a demo phase called the Good Practices TV, Internet TV for Risk and Communication, and the other part, or the other component is, or activity, is the Eager Project Media component, which is a project that we have been involved in. So the Good Practices TV, it's a working title, so they're still deciding what to call it, but it will focus on risk communication, and its aim is to be like a Netflix for risk-informed development and decision-making. So finding another way of getting this information and the storytelling to people that actually need to know this. It would be aimed at international agencies, NGO, programming staff, local NGOs, community leaders, local government, universities, teachers, students, etc. Let me show you how it looks. There you go. And then also here, you can see some of, I don't know if everybody can see that, but you can see some of the topics and the themes that they are planning to have on this platform. The second aspect that we're trying currently is a project that we've been involved with in 4 Southern African countries called the Eager Project. And the media component that we did regarding this was we identified, or there was a couple of people that we interacted through the process of this project that we then interviewed and asked them about their environment, their experiences, the things that they find difficult, the things that they find threatens them in their environment, and have them discuss this and talk about that. One other component to this was that the kids that were involved in the project in general, they went out and took pictures of the things that threaten them or that they're proud of or that they would like to indicate or communicate to the leaders in their community. And then based on that, they came back and discussed the pictures that they took with the stories attached to that. So this is one way that we can listen and use storytelling to actually bring the experience and perception of risk closer to the researchers. Using media and storytelling can be useful to get people talking about their environment. Obviously, there are a lot of benefits and weaknesses in using this type of media, but it's one way in a vast collection of options that we can try and can use. And as I've learned from yesterday, this is where I should say, I will stop here now.